You think about the early relationships that we have as kind of helping us create a blueprint that we then use to predict how other people will receive us and how likely they are to perhaps try to meet our needs and how effective they are at that. If we have early relationships where there's a lot of misattunement, where our needs go chronically unmet, and I'm not just talking about our needs for, a roof over our heads and food in our bellies, but like that emotional safety and feeling seen and soothed by the people who are there to keep us safe. And if that doesn't happen, then we have a blueprint that we're then going to carry out into the world as we go outside of our family relationships. And we're going to use that blueprint. And it can also create sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy sometimes. Like if I don't believe that people want to help me or meet my needs or can soothe me when I'm upset, I might go into the world avoiding connecting with people because I don't really think that they will help me. Alternatively, I might go out into the world kind of, really barreling towards people, being like, you gotta help me, like, help me, right? Like, and that's also going to get us responses from people that are likely misattuned to our needs for that safety and connection. And so we kind of can get stuck in these patterns. And that's when we talk about an attachment style. We're talking about these repeated patterns that show up in relationships all over the place that are usually like kind of traceable back to that early blueprint. And so a lot of the work that I do in helping like heal attachment wounds is to go back to the blueprint and say, how can we edit this? What have we learned in our life about the safety of the world around us that might shift some of these early blueprints, perhaps?
It's so fascinating to me because it's true. If you are used to having relationships that are hurtful to you or that cause you pain, then why would you want to have a deep connected relationship when you're an adult? That must feel really scary.
Yeah, so sometimes we avoid it, or sometimes we kind of have this like ambivalence towards it. Like I really, really, really want like this hunger for it, but then this fear around it. So we show up kind of anxious in those relationships.
How many adults actually have secure attachment styles?
The research shows that it's about somewhere between 60 and 70% of the population globally have a secure attachment style, which we tend to measure through something called the AAI, which is the Adult Attachment Inventory. And we also know that an adult attachment style is predictive of their child's attachment style with 70% accuracy. So that means if I have a secure attachment style and before I ever have kids, right? And I have a child and by the time that child's 1, if we measure that child's attachment style, there's a 70% chance-ish that that child will also have a secure attachment style. If I have an avoidant attachment style, there's also a very high likelihood that that child is going to have an avoidant attachment style. It's not guaranteed, right? 70%. There's like a range of that. I say that because it's hopeful, right? Like if you have attachment ruptures and trauma in your past and you maybe have an insecure attachment style in certain places, it doesn't automatically mean that your kid will too. I think that one of the variables that could change that trajectory is something we call reflective functioning, which is our ability to reflect on the inner world of another, what their thoughts and feelings might be, and the inner world of our own self, right? Reflect on what we might be thinking and feeling in a given moment. High reflective functioning tends to be another predictor of attachment security. And so that's something we can build in parents. It's a skill that we can definitely help a person develop so that we can kind of change course.
Is that a fancy way for saying the ability to try and stand in somebody else's shoes?
Yeah.
Okay. It's true. The more empathetic you are, the more you try to see something from someone else's perspective. It can make a huge difference on how you feel towards them.
Right. And I think also because if you have an attachment wound, your ability to say, oh man, perhaps I didn't get my needs met by my parent in the way I needed. And also I can imagine that my parent might have been trying and doing the best they could, but they just couldn't meet my needs in that moment. Or perhaps they weren't trying the way I needed them to, but they had other things that were making it really hard for them to. my ability to imagine the inner struggle of my parent, it doesn't mean that I don't have pain, but it allows me to be separate from that, to just have this awareness and this ability to feel like I'm separate from the pain of my parents, which then allows me to feel more whole, right? Like my pain is real, but it's not dependent on them anymore, right? Because otherwise, I think if we don't have that ability to reflect on that parent, and this is like the generational impact of trauma, right? We call it the intergenerational transmission of trauma. Our attachment wounds are likely the same attachment wounds our parents had and that their parents had and their parents had, because we teach this stuff implicitly, and we can disrupt it sort of explicitly. Like we can consciously say, I'm going to do something different than what I received as a kid. But that takes awareness.
I think that makes so much sense to me. Something that I try to teach my kid is the skill of not trying to take things personally, which I think is so hard to do. But I think that it resonates with what you're saying, because if I ever have a friend, for example, who doesn't call me back, it can be really quick to jump to the conclusion, oh my goodness, they're being mean to me, or it's something that they're doing to me. And later you might find out, oh my goodness, they never got the message, or it was a really stressful week for them, or they had a lot going on that week. And so oftentimes I find that when I step into my friend's world a little bit, when I try to picture what might be going on for them, it just softens everything. It makes things feel less personal, and it makes me not feel negative feeling towards them.
Right. But you still get to have your feelings, right? I think that might be the piece that you were circling around, like, right? My kids, if I can help my kids not take something personally, that's by sort of imagining, oh, maybe that person had something else going on and it wasn't about their motivation, or their intention might have been, not to hurt you. But you might still feel hurt, and that's okay. Right. And
Yes.
to name that, to say, yeah, it does hurt when someone doesn't meet our need. Or, being more specific and explicit with a kid, like it does hurt when someone doesn't call you back.
Yes.
Now we can validate that feeling hurt and practice that reflective functioning. I wonder what might have been happening for that person that they were unable to call you back in that moment. It did hurt your feelings. And also, I wonder why they weren't able to call you, or chose not to call you, whatever you could. But that it moves us out of, you get one or the other. You either have to, you get your feelings and you don't think about the other person's perspective, or you don't get to have your feelings because you're thinking about the other person's perspective. And I think it's both. We get to
like
have
that
the
a
feelings
lot.
we have, and we can imagine the feelings of another.
That's true, because if you're only looking at the other person's perspective, it's as if we have to be Superman, just completely empathetic without having feelings. But you're right. If we feel our feelings validated, that does make so much sense.
And as a parent, if you want to encourage your child to imagine the perspective and motivations of another person who has just left them feeling hurt, if you start there, they're probably going to feel a little unseen, right? Like, if I'm really bummed that my friend didn't call me back and I'm really kind of hurting, and I say to you, Mom, oh my God, they're so mean. They didn't call me, and I know they went out with this other person and they didn't include me, and I'm really mad. If we go straight to, oh, well, I'm sure they had a reason. That's a good part to go to, but I wouldn't start there, right? I'd go to, that doesn't feel good. Yeah. I can understand why you feel that way. You're mad, or you're sad, or you're hurt, whatever. Name the thing. Or I wonder if you don't know. And then you can try to help them perspective take. But I wouldn't start with the perspective taking until you can validate the experience, because like our ability to reflect is going to be enhanced when we feel seen.
This reminds me why I love podcasting so much, because this is such a great nugget that I'm going to take with me. So thank you so much in my own life and for my children. Thank you.
Oh, gosh, I'm glad.
So now you're a mom of two, and you are passionate, and your podcast is all about being securely attached. How do you do it as a working mom? How do you ensure that you give your kids secure attachment. Do you have any tips and techniques for anybody listening?
Yeah, definitely. And like, I think, we talk about attachment. It's a buzzy word. People are talking about it a lot. And I think on the one hand, that's fantastic because I think it really is saying that the world of parenting is becoming more connected to the research on attachment, and they're becoming more aware of this idea. And we're moving into a population of parents and a generation of parents who are aware of this and care about it and oriented towards it. And that's fantastic. I also think the sort of pop culturalization of attachment theory creates what I sometimes like refer to as like the telephone tag phenomenon, whereas like everybody's talking about attachment and then everyone else is listening to those people talk about attachment, who's listening to someone else talk about attachment. And so like the message is getting distorted or diluted or warped a little bit. And I think it's really important for people to understand, like, okay, if you want to know how to support your child's attachment, you got to kind of understand what attachment theory is, because I think there's some misunderstanding around it. And it's caused a lot of parents that I talk to feel tremendous pressure to like get this right all the time. And then we just are feeling like anxious because that's impossible to get it right all the time, to be like perfectly attuned to our kid all the time, to meet their needs all the time. So first of all, attachment theory is very simple. It just simply says that as human beings, we are born with a sort of hardwiring, biological, evolutionarily based drive to attach to our primary care figure or attachment figure to increase our chance of survival. That's it. We all attach. The quality of that attachment is the thing we care about in psychology. How secure or insecure is that attachment relationship? It's also important to know that we have different attachment relationships with everybody that we are in a relationship with. And we tend to talk about attachment styles, and that's looking at patterns in the aggregate. But every single relationship you have individually can be secure or less, more or less secure, right? Like if you have a boss that's super critical of everything that you do, you're going to feel pretty insecurely attached to that boss. But you might have a secure attachment style overall. You also may have a insecure attachment style overall because that blueprint that we were talking about at the beginning, it lends itself to feeling less trusting and more scared and, more insecure in the world. But you have like that one friend that you feel so secure with. That's a secure relationship, even if you have an insecure attachment style, in quotes. So those are some myths, I think, about attachment that I think are really important to just kind of put out there, explain first.
I appreciate you clarifying that, because I feel like personally I'm a pretty securely attached person, but I have had friendships where I could feel insecure. So I think to myself, why am I feeling insecure here? I'm not an insecure person with relationships on the whole. But you're right. If they don't call you back a lot, or if they're acting a certain way, you might feel like that in that particular relationship. No, so thank you for clarifying that.
Yeah, definitely.
All the buzzwords now with they put you in a box. I feel like you're either secure, insecure, avoidant, the mixed. It's so, and it seems too rigid. So I agree with you.
Yeah. And so we want people to understand, one, attachment's flexible. It's not fixed. We can have different attachment styles kind of showing up in different types of relationships, and it can change over time, right? If I do that work to become more, to find safer people, to become more reflective, to become more aware of my blueprint and make efforts to edit it usually with the support of a therapist, right? We can shift the pattern of our attachment. We can repair if we've kind of maybe we had postpartum depression and we really were not able to like be there for our child in the way they needed us to, or we had a child whose needs were so intense because they had a really just sensitive temperament, and whatever reason we couldn't soothe them in the way that they needed us to. And maybe we have some insecure patterns showing up in our relationship with our kid. That doesn't mean that we're fixed. It's written in stone. Like, we can modify that. So, but if you're asking like just straight up, like, what are the things to focus on if I want to sort of support security in my relationship with my kid? There's a really good book, a bunch of books that Dan Siegel and Tina Payne Bryson have written, but one specifically is called The Power of Showing Up. And they talk about the 4 S's, and it's our ability to feel seen, our ability to be soothed when we're in distress, and our ability to feel safe with that caregiver. Those 3 things lead to security. That's the 4th S, which I think is a nice, easy way to simplify it. We need to be able to see our kids for who they are, not for who we want them to be or think they should be, or, whatever else we're projecting onto them. We need to be able to soothe them when they are in distress. And importantly, that doesn't mean take away all their distress or make their distress stop. I can be distressed and soothed at the same time. That's something I think people don't quite get. They think, well, my child's still upset and I'm doing all the things, and they're not being upset anymore. And the reality is like, you can be soothed while you are upset. There could be an absence of soothing while you are upset, right? Think about a time when like you felt really, really upset, and so upset that you weren't going to calm down right away. And if you had someone that just sort of sat next to you and said, "You're so upset, I get it," you don't need to calm down in that moment or stop being upset to have felt soothed by that person. So when we think about our kid being like in great distress and we're trying to soothe them, let's make sure we're not conflating soothing with turning off the distress, because that might not happen right away. But our ability to say like, I'm here for you and I can try to help ease the aloneness that you feel in this distress. That's soothing. So we don't have to rescue, we don't have to turn it off to soothe. And then, yeah, we want to make our kids feel safe with us. We don't want to be scary with them. We're going to lose our cool sometimes. We're going to yell. We're going to be scary. But if we are scary, we want to recognize that and repair. And if we are chronically scary, we have to do some work and figure out why am I showing up in this way? Why am I getting so dysregulated that I'm scaring my kid? No parent's trying to do that. So we got to, again, like that's where the awareness comes in. That's where looking at our old stuff comes in. And then, so those are the things that I think are the most important. And then I want to put a big, big, big umbrella over all of those things and say, we have to do this enough of the time. Not all of the time. Definitely not 100% of the time, because you just won't ever be able to do that. But research says like 55% of the time is predictive of secure attachment. So we don't have to get this right nearly as much as I think parents think they do, which is so important. The good enough parent is optimal, not settling for good enough. Like, oh, well, I can't be perfect, I guess I'll be good enough. It's like, no, good enough is the goal. It's optimal. It's the healthiest possible way to show up for your kid.
I'm so glad that you gave that umbrella, because that was going to be my next question is, we can't possibly be perfect. We can't do all of those things all of the time. So you're helping me, because I have to admit, I still feel guilty. Like I had my first kid, I was a pediatric resident, and I had to go back to work after 5 weeks. And I still think about that. Like every time she has a tantrum, I think, is that because of me? Did I go back to work too soon? And I try to be, I try to be a good mom as best I can, but I still can't help but feel some of that guilt for not showing up as best I feel like a mom should be there in the early years. But she's turning out to be a fine young girl. But sometimes I do reflect on that, like, that early attachment. I hope I was around enough.
Yeah. And it's like, I think it's a lot more about quality than quantity. And as a working parent, I think it's super important to hear that, because I am a working mom. I've worked my kids' entire lives. I've been working, and I too felt the guilt. And I too was like, especially with my first, when I had to go back to work, and I was lucky enough to get 4 months, which not everybody gets. And even that didn't feel like enough. I don't think a year would have felt like enough, but like
Definitely.
I went back to work and I had those feelings of like, oh my God, someone else is going to be taking care of him and soothing him and seeing him and making him feel safe. And like, he's going to get more attached to them than me. They're with him more than I am. And it's true. His care providers, he went to daycare and he was with his daycare teacher more hours than he was with me in a given day. But we have to remember, one, our kids can have multiple, and we want them to have as many as possible, frankly, multiple secure attachment relationships, because those are all going into that blueprint, right? The more data that blueprint is receiving, that the world is safe and that people are going to meet our needs most of the time, enough of the time, and that we can trust that people will see us and take care of us and be interested in who we are. That's going into the blueprint. That makes for a much more robust blueprint. But it's also important, especially for working moms who are going back to work after having a baby, who I know 100% of them have at least one point in their, that transition had the thought, oh my God, is this going to mess up my relationship with my kid? The reality is there's something very important and special about that primary attachment figure. And even if we're not with them all the time we spend with them is so intimate, is so just attuned and loving. And again, we're not always going to show up that way. Like when you get home from work and you're exhausted and your baby is crying and they need you and you are just like burnt out and you aren't totally there for them, it's okay. This is a metaphor that I often like to describe it. Like if you think of the attachment relationship as like a stitch in a giant blanket, like you're knitting a giant blanket, and every single stitch is an interaction you have with your kid. Dropping a stitch here, stop dropping there, it's not going to damage the integrity of this blanket, because there's just so many interactions that you have with your kid, right? If we're chronically dropping stitches all the time in a certain period of our lives, you might have to do something to repair that hole. But typically, I think more often than not, parents who are really worried about attachment are probably doing plenty to keep that blanket, nice and sturdy, and drop stitches aren't going to impact that. So, the attachment system is not as fragile as I think we've been made to believe sometimes, or as pop culture has kind of perhaps painted a picture. Like, we're a sturdy species in that respect. And this is a drive for survival. Like, this is really, really deeply rooted in our DNA, like our biology. It's not that fragile. It's served us very well for a very long time.